Ferda Rosnova never expected his father to call him with a marriage proposal, but when he hears the name of his future partner, he realizes this is not the kind of opportunity people would normally celebrate. His father has already decided that he will marry Archduke Valdrova, and he makes it clear that Ferda should understand the meaning behind this arrangement. For someone born into a noble family, this kind of engagement leaves no room to choose his own path. Rejecting it would mean being removed from the family, while accepting it would only push him into a future where he has no control over his own life. Still, the marriage itself is not the only thing troubling him. What hurts the most is that he has spent his entire life trying to earn a place inside the very family that never accepted him. Ever since he was young, Ferda has been treated like someone who doesn't belong. While the other members of the Rosnova family possess talent and abilities, he struggles to prove himself, despite having no natural gift. The servants often laugh at him whenever they see him training, making fun of his efforts and calling him weak because they believe someone like him will never achieve anything. Even though nobody supports him, Ferda continues practicing every day. He ignores the insults and keeps moving forward because he still hopes that his hard work will eventually reach someone in his family. More than becoming a knight or gaining recognition from others, what he truly wants is for his father to look at him and acknowledge him as his son. Every time he trains, he secretly hopes to see even a small sign of approval from his father, but that hope only leads to more disappointment. One day, while Ferda is training, his older brother appears and starts mocking him for wasting his time. He questions whether Ferda has lost his mind for still trying to become a knight despite having no talent. The situation quickly turns into another humiliation for Ferda as his brother defeats him and leaves him lying on the ground. Instead of encouraging him, his brother tells him that he never had the qualifications to become a knight and insults him by calling him an outcast. Ferda can do nothing but endure it. Even after being treated like this, he still looks toward the mansion, hoping that someone from his family will finally stand beside him. That is when he notices his father watching from the window. For a moment, Ferda thinks his father might finally interfere, but his father simply turns away and leaves without saying anything. There is no anger, no concern, and no attempt to help him. That single action tells Ferda everything he needed to know. The people he spent years trying to impress had already abandoned him. The family he wanted to be accepted by had never truly considered him one of their own. After this realization, Ferda makes his decision. He enters his father's office and tells him that he is leaving the Rosnova family. He no longer wants to stay somewhere he has never been accepted. His father listens quietly, but his expression remains cold. There is no attempt to change Ferda's mind, and no emotion appears on his face. He simply accepts his son's decision as if it has no meaning to him. That night, Ferda walks out of the mansion and stands beyond the gates that he once called home. Before leaving him behind, his father gives him one last reminder. From that moment onward, Ferda is no longer a member of the Rosnova family. After leaving the Rosnova mansion behind, Ferda is filled with anger toward the family that abandoned him. He remembers how much effort he put in, how many times he trained despite having no talent, and how his father knew all of that, but still chose to throw him away. At that point, Ferda decides that he will never forgive the people who treated him like he was worthless. As those feelings continue growing inside him, a strange red magic circle appears around him. His hatred and desire for revenge become the trigger that awakens something hidden within him. On that day, Ferda gains magical power and becomes a mage at the age of 18. However, even after awakening, he doesn't receive the respect he expected. The other apprentices immediately start making fun of him because they believe he is too old to begin learning magic. They laugh at him, questioning whether someone like him can even understand the basics of magic. Since most mages use their internal energy as the foundation of their abilities, they assume Ferda has no chance of becoming powerful. But Ferda doesn't respond to their insults. Instead, he releases his mana and proves that his power power is completely different from what they expected. The amount of magical energy he possesses overwhelms everyone around him. A red magic circle forms once again, and Ferda reveals the source of his strength. His magic is being powered by his hatred and his wish to take revenge. The more intense those emotions become, the stronger his magic grows. From that moment, Ferda understands that his hatred itself is the key to increasing his power. Using that ability, Ferda continues developing his magic until he reaches the 6th circle. With this new strength, he returns to the Rosnova mansion, the place where he spent years being looked down on. This time, he is no longer the powerless son everyone ignored. The first people he targets are the servants who constantly mocked him and treated him like he was nothing. Using his magic, Ferda forces them to destroy themselves as punishment for everything they did to him. After dealing with them, he moves on to his 2 older brothers. Instead of simply attacking them, he uses his power to fill their hearts with hatred toward each other. The brothers who once stood together begin turning against one another, and Ferda watches as their conflict continues until both of them are left broken. Finally, Ferda faces the person who caused him the most pain, his own father. The man who once ignored him and cast him out is now reduced to begging Ferda to end his suffering. But Ferda doesn't forget the years he spent trying to gain his father's approval. He tells him to look at what happened to the Rosnova family, the very family he was so proud of building. Seeing everything he protected collapse in front of him completely breaks his father. After that, the Rosnova name disappears, along with everything connected to the family. But even after getting his revenge, Ferda realizes that destroying the people who hurt him doesn't remove the hatred inside him. His actions attract the attention of powerful figures across the continent. Many influential people join forces and come after him, declaring him the greatest enemy the continent has ever seen. They believe they can finally bring him to justice. But Ferda continues surviving every battle against them. His power keeps growing until he reaches the 8th circle of magic, a level no ordinary human can achieve. By reaching this stage, Ferda becomes an archmage. Even with that power, Ferda knows the people who hate him will never stop coming after him. If he wants to stand above everyone and never fear anyone again, he needs to reach the 9th circle, a realm that belongs beyond normal humans and is said to be the level of a demigod. He begins searching through ancient records, looking for a way to break through this final barrier. After countless searches, he finally finds the last requirement needed to reach that level. But when he reads the answer written in the ancient book, Ferda wonders if fate itself is mocking him. The final ingredient needed for him to enter the 9th circle is not some rare treasure or forgotten artifact. It is the heart of the Red Dragon, Archduke Valdrova. The dragon looks at Ferda and says fate has a cruel sense of humor. She never expected that the man who was once supposed to become her husband would eventually appear in front of her with the intention of taking her life. Ferda is already covered in blood from the battle, breathing heavily and struggling to stay on his feet. He tells Valdrova to stop talking and accept her death. The dragon says she knows that people call her a tyrant, but she still cannot understand why Ferda hates her so much. She explains that she spent most of her life isolated from the world and never really understood why humans feared or resented her. Hearing that makes Ferda angrier. He asks if she truly believes she did nothing wrong, then reminds her that her obsession with finding a human groom was the reason he was cast out of his own family. Valdrova seems genuinely confused and asks whether that is really her fault. Ferda immediately says yes. In his eyes, the greed of a dragon who wanted a human partner destroyed his entire life. The dragon quietly says that she now understands. Her calm reaction catches Ferda off guard because it is not what he expected from someone he considered a tyrant. For a brief moment, he becomes suspicious, but he quickly uses the pause to recover some of his mana. A second later, Valdrova moves and swings her claw at him. Ferda immediately raises a magic barrier to defend himself, expecting a fatal attack. The impact is strong enough to make blood run down his face, but then he notices something strange. The blood is not his. Valdrova has driven her own claws into her chest and is tearing it open herself. Ferda stares at her in confusion, unable to understand why she would injure herself during the fight. The dragon asks him whether his magic truly requires a dragon's heart. Ferda instantly realizes what she is trying to do and yells at her to stop. She continues opening her chest little by little while he desperately tries to stop her because that heart is the only thing he needs to reach the 9th circle. He fires a spell directly at her and the attack strikes her in the center of the chest, causing the massive dragon to stagger backward. Even after being hit, her claws continue pressing against her chest, and Ferda watches in panic as she collapses to the ground. For a moment, he fears that the heart has been destroyed. Then he notices a bright golden light reflecting in his eyes. Looking closer, he sees that the dragon heart is still intact. Valdrova calmly tells him to take it. Ferda cannot understand why she would hand over something so important when she could have continued fighting. The dragon explains that she realized her existence only brought suffering to him. As she speaks, she begins remembering her own past. She admits that she always hated herself and the violent instincts that came with being a dragon. She could never accept the part of herself that wanted to destroy things for no reason. Whenever she took human form, people reacted with fear, and her presence brought chaos wherever she went. She knew that simply existing was enough to terrify everyone around her. Valdrova says she should never have dreamed of living happily among humans, because that wish ended up causing pain for many people. A tear falls from the eye of the defeated dragon as she tells Ferda that since everyone suffered because of her, she hopes he can at least find happiness through her sacrifice. After saying that, the giant dragon loses her strength and falls lifeless into the darkness. Ferda feels a strange pressure in his chest, a feeling he cannot explain. He becomes irritated that the victory he wanted for so long leaves such an unpleasant feeling behind. Trying to push those thoughts away, he reminds himself that the ninth circle is now within reach. He picks up the glowing dragon heart and prepares to absorb its power. Ferda believes that if he can take in all of that energy, he will finally surpass the limits of humanity and be reborn as a true demigod. When he absorbs the heart, a massive explosion of light and dust consumes the entire area. When the light disappears, the battlefield is gone, and Ferda finds himself floating naked in an endless dark void. He is confused because the absorption should have worked perfectly, yet he feels as if he is slowly sinking deeper and deeper into an infinite swamp. At first, he assumes it might be a side effect of absorbing such an overwhelming power. Then, an unfamiliar wave of emotions suddenly crashes into his mind. A violent surge of magical electricity strikes his head in the middle of the darkness, and Ferda realizes with shock that those feelings and memories do not belong to him. They belong to Valdrova. The hatred he carried for years had been built on the belief that she intentionally ruined his life. But the memories show someone who was struggling with her own loneliness and self-loathing. Back in the dark void, Ferda feels the emotions left behind by the dragon more strongly than before. The anger that had always fueled his magic becomes difficult to hold on to. The memories show him a level of loneliness and suffering that makes his own struggles feel much smaller in comparison. At the same time, he can also feel the gentle loneliness that Valdrova carried for so long. Ferda starts crying and questions himself about what he had truly been chasing all this time. He spent years believing that his goal was to become an archmage, get revenge on everyone who looked down on him, and eventually reach the power of a demigod. But when he thinks about it carefully, he realizes none of those things were what he truly wanted. His mind goes back to his childhood, when he was just a small boy sitting alone at a table and drawing. The picture he made wasn't about power or becoming someone important. He had simply drawn his family standing together. More than anything, he wanted to be accepted by them and live peacefully with the people he called his family. That was the only wish he had from the beginning. Remembering Valdrova's human form, Ferda begins to wonder if she was searching for the exact same thing. Maybe she also wanted a normal life where she could stay with someone and be accepted instead of being feared. The more he thinks about it, the more meaningless his entire journey starts to feel. All the battles, all the revenge, and all the power he gained led him to this moment where the person he wanted to kill was already gone because of him. The ninth circle and his revenge no longer feel as important as they once did. Tears fall from Ferda's eyes as he regrets what he has done. Then he remembers the power that comes with reaching the ninth circle. The only magic a ninth circle mage can use is the wish spell. Even though he feels that everything has already gone too far, Ferda decides to use that final spell. Standing inside the glowing magic circle, he activates the wish spell. As the magic begins working, Ferda hears a familiar voice calling his name. He opens his eyes and finds himself back inside the luxurious office of the Rosnova mansion. Standing in front of him is his father, Arinal Rosnova, who is scolding him for losing focus during their conversation. Ferda recognizes the scene. He remembers that this was the same day when his father told him about the arranged marriage with Archduke Valdrova. He also remembers that this man eventually lost his mind before his death. Listening to his father's words again, Ferda realizes that he has truly returned to the past. His father repeats the same announcement, saying that the engagement has already been decided and that Ferda should understand what accepting it means. When he warns Ferda about the consequences of refusing the engagement, Ferda steps forward and interrupts him. This time, he knows exactly what awaits him, but he refuses to run away. Ferda declares that he accepts the engagement with Archduke Valdrova. Hukan Rosnova, Ferda's second older brother, is unable to hide his surprise after hearing that Ferda accepted the engagement. He asks the servant beside him if he heard correctly, because Ferda has never been the type of person who would willingly choose something that could destroy his own future. The butler explains that Ferda is supposed to leave soon, but instead of preparing for the journey, he dismissed all the servants and locked himself inside his room. Hearing this, Hukan smiles because he assumes Ferda must be suffering inside and decides to visit him just to see his desperate expression one last time. Inside his room, Ferda walks around while preparing himself. He is no longer the same person who once broke down after hearing about the engagement. When Hukan suddenly kicks the door open and angrily asks why Ferda is still there instead of leaving, he expects to see his younger brother in a miserable state. However, the scene in front of him is totally different. Ferda is getting dressed, which surprises Hukan because he was certain Ferda would be crying or trying to escape. Ferda looks at him and points out that entering someone's room without knocking is quite rude. When Hukan questions why he is preparing himself alone, Ferda explains that he dismissed the servants because he wants to get used to doing things without anyone's help. Hukan immediately notices that something about Ferda has changed. The sudden confidence and calm attitude make him suspicious, so he asks if Ferda truly understands what this engagement means. Ferda answers that he knows exactly what it means. Accepting this marriage means leaving the Rosnova family behind. Hukan laughs and tells him that Ferda doesn't seem to understand the real situation. This is not just about being removed from the family, he is walking toward his own destruction. Hukan explains that there is a reason why the position of Valdrova's groom has always remained empty. Despite hearing all of this, Ferda says that he already knows everything. In the past, Valdrova's first groom was the third prince of the empire. He was considered the perfect candidate because of his intelligence, appearance, and status. He was even willing to give up his chance at becoming emperor just to accept the engagement with the dragon. But after arriving at Valdrova's territory, only one day later, the prince returned in a terrible condition. His eyes were left totally paralyzed, and his entire body had been beaten to the point where he was barely recognizable. Hukan points at Ferda and asks if he honestly believes he can survive something that even a prince couldn't handle. After saying that, Hukan decides he won't stop someone who is determined to walk straight into the dragon's territory. However, before leaving, Hukan gives Ferda a warning. He tells him not to even think about escaping from the engagement because if Ferda tries to run away, Hukan himself will take his head before Valdrova gets the chance. Ferda looks at his brother with a cold expression and tells him that he should learn to control himself first. He then brings up the secret that everyone already knows, the way Hukan keeps looking at their oldest brother's wife. The moment Hukan hears this, he loses his temper and tries to attack him, but Ferda reminds him to control his anger. He even says that he cannot afford to damage his face right now because he still has a long journey ahead of him to the dragon's territory. After that, Ferda simply says goodbye and continues preparing for his departure. Before leaving the Rosnova mansion, Ferda stops in front of the old butler who is crying while saying that serving him all these years was an honor. In his previous life, Ferda would have believed those words, but now he knows the truth. He remembers that this same servant was one of the people who secretly harmed him, even poisoning his food while he was still a child. Back then, Ferda thought he was simply born weak and sickly, never realizing that the people around him were the reason his health kept getting worse. Even with those memories coming back, Ferda does not act on his anger. Instead, he places his hand on the butler's shoulder and thanks him for his years of service. His words sound polite, but the hidden meaning behind them makes the servant uncomfortable. Ferda then asks him to take care of the Rosnova family while he is gone before stepping into the carriage. As the carriage begins moving away from the mansion, Ferda looks outside the window and watches the scenery passing by. Unlike his first life, his mind feels strangely calm. He thinks that perhaps the reason he no longer carries the same anger is because he already achieved his revenge once before. The hatred that once controlled him and pushed him forward has disappeared. Ferda compares his old red magic to something similar to a drug. In the beginning, it gave him a feeling of excitement and power, making every moment of revenge feel satisfying. But as he continued relying on that power, he became unable to control himself. The magic that was created from hatred slowly turned into something that damaged his mind and his soul. During those years, destruction felt enjoyable because he was completely consumed by that feeling. But now, Ferda no longer wants to return to that empty way of living. For the first time in a long while, he can appreciate the peace he is feeling. Eventually, the journey comes to an end. The coachman nervously informs Ferda that they have arrived at their destination. In front of them is a wooden sign standing in the middle of the forest, warning that this area belongs to the Duke's territory and unauthorized people are not allowed to enter. Ferda steps down from the carriage and calmly sits on his luggage while waiting. The coachman wastes no time leaving, shouting from a distance that he hopes the young master remains safe. With no one around to watch him, Ferda thinks this might actually be convenient. If any wild creatures appear, he can simply use some basic fourth circle magic to deal with them. While he waits, the wind begins blowing through the forest and carries several leaves past him. Ferda notices movement among the trees and focuses his attention toward the source. Hidden between the plants is the figure of a young woman wearing a maid uniform. She walks toward him and introduces herself as Ruri, a servant who works for Valdrova. She asks if he is Ferda Rosnova, and he calmly confirms his identity. Ruri then gestures for him to follow her, explaining that she will guide him to the castle. As they walk through the forest, Ferda thinks about the land he has entered. The people of the Arkan Empire always believed their nation held absolute power, while ignoring the problems within their own borders. In the eastern part of the continent lies a dangerous region filled with monsters that humans were unable to control. Yet it was Valdrova, the red dragon they feared so much, who managed to stop those creatures and protect the border. Ferda finds it strange that someone who built such an important defense for humanity is remembered only as a monster. He recalls how people spread rumors claiming that she was secretly raising an army of beasts, but those same people would never dare say such things while standing in front of the dragon herself. As wolves begin appearing around them in the forest, she tells him not to worry and uses her magic to create a protective effect around them, making sure the beasts will not attack without reason while she is there. Ferda then asks how much longer they have to walk, and Ruri answers that it will take around 2 hours. Hearing that, Ferda becomes curious because she had arrived at the meeting point much faster than that. Ruri simply explains that if she traveled alone and flew there, it would only take about 10 seconds. After hearing that, Ferda understands that she is not a normal maid. She is a dragon spawn with natural physical strength and magical abilities, hiding her horns and tail so humans cannot recognize her true identity. Ferda plants his wooden staff into the ground and suggests that they should just fly to the castle instead of walking all the way there. Ruri looks at him and asks if that means she has to carry him the entire way. Ferda says he can handle flying himself, but Ruri simply replies that she does not want to carry him. The conversation ends there, and the two continue walking through the forest without saying much. After walking for some time, Ferda suggests taking a short rest, but Ruri tells him they cannot stop because her master is already waiting for him. With no other choice, Ferda keeps following her through the forest. While walking, he thinks about how complicated this marriage has become. Eventually, they arrive at Valdrova's castle. Ruri steps forward and knocks on the huge entrance door, announcing that her master's groom has finally arrived. As the doors open, Ferda feels the presence of the dragon from inside the castle. Even without seeing her, he can tell that Valdrova is far beyond an ordinary opponent. Ruri tells him to wait outside while she goes inside to inform her master, but Ferda says he wants to speak with Valdrova directly. Ruri looks annoyed and asks if he really thinks someone like him can simply meet the Duke face to face. Shortly after, she returns with a message from Valdrova. Ruri tells Ferda that her master acknowledges the effort he made to reach this place, but Valdrova has no intention of forcing a marriage that neither side wants. She has no interest in continuing with an engagement created only by an agreement between families, so Ferda is asked to return home. After traveling all this way, Ferda is surprised that the answer is simply to leave. In his previous life, Ferda would have accepted those words. Leaving the dragon's territory was exactly what he wanted back then. But now, things are different. He did not come here because he was forced to. He came here because he decided to. Ferda tells Ruri that he has no intention of leaving and that he still wants to proceed with the engagement. He asks her to deliver that answer to Valdrova. Although Ruri is clearly not happy about it, she accepts and prepares to take his message back to her master. A little later, Ruri comes back carrying a huge sack filled with gold coins and drops it on the ground in front of Ferda. She tells him that the Duke appreciates the courage it took for him to come all the way here and is giving him enough money to leave and start a new life somewhere else. Ferda looks at the gold for a moment and says he has no interest in money or status. He tells her directly that the only reason he came to this castle is to go through with the engagement to Valdrova. Ruri lets out a frustrated sigh and loses her patience. She clenches her fist and orders him to leave immediately. Ferda notices that the way she is speaking sounds much harsher than the message she delivered earlier, so he points out that those words do not seem like they came from the Duke. Ruri admits that this time she is speaking for herself. Horns appear on her head, her nails turn into claws, and a green aura spreads around her as her tail becomes visible. Ferda realizes that this is dragon fear. The pressure forces him to the ground. Ruri looks down at him and says that humans like him are usually driven by greed and ambition. Ferda then understands why the third prince ended up in such a terrible condition. Ruri confirms that the prince only accepted the engagement because he wanted to use the marriage to control and dominate the dragon. She says he was arrogant enough to believe he could hide those intentions. Standing over Ferda, she tells him that she sees no difference between him and the prince and asks if he wants to end up the same way. Even with Ruri holding him down, Ferda stays calm. He swears that he is telling the truth and says that nobody forced him to come here. He also says he is not looking for money, power, or any personal gain. Ferda remembers that, in his previous life, Valdrova gave up her own heart to save someone as selfish as he used to be. He tells Ruri that this time he wants to stand by her side and that he came here to be her groom. He also says that if they are really going to be engaged, Valdrova should speak to him herself instead of sending messages through a maid. Ruri becomes furious and raises her claws to attack him, but she suddenly stops before the strike lands. After standing there for a moment, she pulls her hand back and says she needs to be excused for a minute. Ferda tells her to go ahead, and Ruri heads back into the castle to report his words to her master. Inside the castle, Ruri kneels in front of the enormous dragon and repeats everything Ferda said outside. She tells her master that the young man insisted he came by his own choice and that he wanted to speak with Valdrova directly. Hearing that, Grand Duchess Valdrova appears in her human form and asks if he really said all of that. Curious about someone who could speak so boldly, she says she wants to see what kind of person he actually is. Ruri begins describing him. She says he is incredibly weak and looked ready to collapse from exhaustion after the walk through the forest. At first, she even suggests throwing him out immediately, but Valdrova gives her a look that makes her stop talking. Ruri awkwardly changes her tone and admits that the young man is actually quite handsome. Valdrova points out that this still does not answer her question, so Ruri finally gives a more serious explanation. She says that, as a dragon spawn, it is normally very easy for her to terrify ordinary humans. Most people panic the moment she releases her aura, but Ferda did not show any sign of fear, even after she used her full dragon fear. Because of that, Ruri believes he will be able to look directly at Valdrova without freezing in terror. Hearing this, Valdrova lets out a small laugh that surprises Ruri. The Duchess says she likes that attitude and is pleased that there is finally a human who can meet her gaze and speak with her normally. Ruri is clearly confused by how happy her master seems and repeats the word normally in surprise. Valdrova simply confirms it and gives her next order. Ruri bows and accepts it without arguing. arguing. She then returns outside and tells Ferda that Valdrova has decided to continue with the engagement after all. Ruri leads him into the castle and shows him the guest room where he will be staying. Ferda is surprised by how clean and well-maintained the room is and asks who takes care of the castle. Ruri answers that she is the only servant living there besides Valdrova herself. She adds that she is her master's only attendant and reminds Ferda that for now, he is still just a guest in the castle. Ferda finds it strange that Ruri keeps calling him a guest, but she explains that the marriage has not happened yet, so that is exactly what he is. Ferda compares her to a guard dog protecting the place, and then asks when the engagement ceremony will take place. Ruri tells him that it will happen 1 month later, and that the ceremony will be simple, taking place inside Valdrova's lair. Ferda listens to everything she explains and accepts it without any complaints. However, he starts thinking about the fact that only 1 month remains until the marriage. Ruri watches him with her arms crossed and warns him that nobody will simply accept him without proof. She tells him that this 1 month is his chance to show whether he has what it takes to become Valdrova's partner. Ferda is surprised by this and asks if this condition came from the Duchess herself. Ruri says it was her own decision. She explains that Valdrova is too kind and would forgive many things, but she will not allow just anyone to stay by her master's side. Ruri tells Ferda that even though his body is weak right now, he needs to show that he has potential. If he cannot prove himself, then she will not accept him as someone suitable for the dragon. Ferda thinks about her words and finds it interesting that Valdrova has someone like Ruri beside her. He respects the fact that the maid is not easily convinced and is only thinking about her master's future. But at the same time, he remembers his previous life and wonders why people like her were not there when everything went wrong. Ferda accepts the challenge and jokingly asks if he needs to become emperor to satisfy her. Ruri replies that he does not need to go that far. She only wants him to reach a point where others cannot look down on him. Ferda finds that answer amusing because he understands what she is really asking for. He needs to show enough ability that even someone above ordinary people would recognize his potential. Still, he accepts all of her conditions and says he understands. Ruri looks at him with annoyance because she cannot understand why he remains so relaxed. She asks if he thinks dealing with dragons is easy or if there is something wrong with him. Ferda simply says that neither is the case and tells her not to worry. He promises that he will show what he is capable of within 1 month. Ruri watches him carefully, still wondering where this confidence is coming from. That night, under the light of the full moon, Ferda walks around his room while thinking about the challenge ahead. He knows he needs to prove himself, but right now, he does not have any magical power. Since mages are extremely rare, most people would have no chance of becoming one. However, Ferda has something no one else has: the memories of reaching the 9th circle in his previous life. If he can find that feeling again, he believes rebuilding his strength will not be impossible. Ferda remembers that the first magic circle is the most important step for a mage because it decides how their mana will flow. The blue circle is created through calm meditation and is the path followed by most mages. The other path is the red circle, which is created through strong emotions and hatred. That was the path Ferda used before, and although it gave him incredible power quickly, it also pushed him toward losing control. He knows that returning to the same path would help him grow faster, but he does not want to repeat the same mistakes. This time, he decides to follow a different route. 1 week passes inside the castle. During the day, Ferda sits in his room and tries to meditate while sitting in the lotus position. After concentrating for a while, a small amount of blue magical energy appears between his hands. But after a short time, the energy disappears. Ferda lets out a tired sigh and realizes that he has failed again. He knows creating a blue circle normally takes around 3 years, but he thought his memories from his previous life would allow him to do it faster. With only 3 weeks remaining, he knows he cannot waste time. Ruri enters his room and asks if he is preparing himself. Ferda says that he is trying, but she looks at the food in front of him and comments that nothing about him seems different yet. Ferda simply eats and says that things will work out if he keeps trying. Ruri does not seem convinced, but she stays quiet. While finishing his meal, Ferda admits to himself that this method is not working and that he needs to find another way. Suddenly, a powerful shaking runs through the room. Ferda looks around and asks what is happening. Ruri explains that her master is currently hunting monsters. She tells him that Valdrova personally deals with the creatures that come from the eastern region. Hearing that, Ferda looks toward the window and quietly says her name. He then stands up and tells Ruri that he wants to see the battle himself. Ruri refuses and asks why he would want to go there. She explains that an ordinary human mind would not be able to handle seeing a battle between beings like that. Ruri mocks Ferda and tells him that if he does not want to embarrass himself before the engagement ceremony, he should stay away from the battle. Ferda rejects that idea and says that if he is going to become Valdrova's companion, then he needs to see her fight with his own eyes. Since he refuses to give up, Ruri spreads her dragon wings and takes him into the sky. After a short flight, they land on a grassy cliff. The speed is so absurd that Ferda drops to his knees the moment they arrive and complains that he feels sick. Ruri tells him to stop focusing on that and look ahead. Ferda raises his head and sees a dark purple mist covering the valley below. Inside the mist, several giant monsters are fighting each other. Suddenly, the red dragon appears in the middle of the battlefield. Valdrova flies through an explosion of flames, while two huge serpent-like monsters attack her. She tears through one of them with her claws and bites into its neck. Flames gather in her mouth, and she releases a huge breath of fire that burns everything below. The heat and wind reach the cliff where Ferda and Ruri are standing, but Ruri remains totally calm. Then the dragon lets out a roar that spreads through the entire valley. Ferda breaks out in a cold sweat. His body starts trembling, and he falls to his knees under the pressure. He realizes that the strength of his future bride is far beyond what he had imagined. Even hearing that roar from a distance is enough to affect him. Ruri looks at him and asks if he understands the situation. She points toward the dragon and tells him that this is the real form of the woman he wants to marry. A creature with that kind of power is not something an ordinary human can stand beside so easily. Ruri notices that Ferda's hand is shaking against the ground and thinks that he is reacting exactly the way she expected. Ruri tells Ferda that red dragons are born with a fierce nature and a constant urge to destroy. She asks if he understands how dangerous it is to become a dragon's companion. In her opinion, humans and dragons can never truly be equals, and she believes Valdrova will eventually realize that this engagement is only a foolish dream. Ferda slowly raises his head and says that the sight is magnificent. Ruri is a little bit shocked by that reaction. She expected him to be terrified after feeling the dragon's roar, but he is looking at Valdrova with admiration instead. Ruri even takes a small step back and wonders if the human is actually crazy for reacting that way. Later that night, they return to the castle. Ferda lies in bed and thinks about the battle. Even though he had tried to prepare himself, the dragon's roar affected him much more than he expected, and his whole body still feels exhausted. He remembers that Ruri looked tired after carrying him back, and thinks it is impressive that he was able to endure the experience at all. As he thinks about the battle, Ferda starts wondering why he insisted on seeing it. The images of Valdrova fighting in the valley keep coming back to his mind. He wants to watch her fight again. She is hiding her true form while fighting monsters on the eastern border to protect the things she cares about, and that determination leaves a strong impression on him. He keeps thinking about Valdrova and the way she fought in the valley. The more he remembers her protecting the eastern border, the more impressed he becomes. Ferda smiles slightly and thinks about how significant it is that someone like her agreed to stand by his side. While he is thinking about her, a red magical energy suddenly begins gathering in his hands. Ferda recognizes it as the red circle and tries to stop it from forming. He knows what happened in his previous life and refuses to walk the same path of hatred again. But when he looks more carefully at the mana, he notices that something is different. The image of Valdrova in battle keeps appearing in his mind, and the feeling inside him is not hatred or revenge. Ferda sits down and begins to meditate while focusing on that strange emotion. As he concentrates, the red mana starts spinning and compressing between his hands. He keeps his attention on that feeling and gradually shapes the energy into a proper magic circle. After a moment, the circle stabilizes successfully. Ferda realizes that this red circle is different from the one he created in the past, and he tells himself that he will not repeat the same mistakes again. The next morning, Ruri enters the room and is shocked to see that Ferda has already activated his mana circuits. She asks if he really managed to do it in a single night. Ferda notices her surprise and admits that he succeeded, while Ruri keeps asking how he accomplished something that should have been impossible. Ferda jokes that he is not an ordinary person and asks what she thinks of his progress. Ruri reluctantly admits that he met the challenge she gave him, although Ferda says he still has a long way to go. He puts aside his napkin and asks if there is a place nearby where he can train properly. And the next scene shifts to a small training field with several straw targets set up on the sandy ground. Ruri arrives carrying a broom and proudly tells him that she prepared the entire area exactly as he requested. Ferda claps and praises her for putting everything together by herself in only half a day. Ruri finds it strange that he asked for simple straw targets instead of expensive training equipment, and Ferda explains that he needs a place where he can practice controlling his mana. Ruri is confused because, for dragons, controlling magical energy is as natural as breathing. Ferda jokes that most humans would call that unfair, but Ruri reminds him that she is a dragon spawn herself. Ferda falls silent for a moment and thinks that people born with natural power can never fully understand the effort humans have to make. Still, he invites her to watch his training. He explains that normal mana control is based on stability, which is why most mages choose the blue circle. However, the red circle works differently. He has to stir his emotions while controlling them at the same time, and that balance is what allows him to use the power properly. In his previous life, it took him a full year just to draw mana from that emotional current and another year to condense it into a single sphere. Because of that experience, he can now recreate the same mana projectile in only a few minutes. Ruri watches as a red sphere forms above Ferda's hand. She is already surprised by that, but then he creates 3 more projectiles without any difficulty. Ferda points toward the targets and gives a simple command. The spheres shoot across the field and hit the target directly. With a loud blast, the straw dummy is destroyed in front of Ruri. Ferda looks at his hands and says with a small smile that he has not forgotten how to use magic after all. Ruri remains silent for a moment, clearly taking the demonstration seriously. Later, she meets Valdrova in a cave and reports that Ferda has already awakened as a mage. Valdrova admits that she does not really know how impressive that is and asks how he performed during the training. Ruri says that he was perfect and did not make a single mistake, which is exactly what makes her suspicious. No ordinary human should be able to perform so perfectly without hiding something, and she even wonders if he is simply a strange person who enjoys dangerous situations. Valdrova finds it amusing that Ruri, who usually doubts humans, is actually impressed by Ferda's abilities. Ruri reluctantly admits that the young man is indeed unusual. The Duchess tells her not to worry and says that she will try to believe the sincerity Ferda showed when he spoke about becoming her companion. However, Ruri still cannot fully relax. She remembers how humans hurt Valdrova in the past and worries that her master might suffer the same thing again. She promises herself that she will protect Valdrova from another disappointment and wants to find out what Ferda is truly thinking. With that in mind, she suggests giving him an important task to test him. Valdrova becomes interested in the idea and asks what kind of task Ruri has planned. Later, Ferda appears in a formal red noble outfit as he enters the meeting hall. Inside, several local lords have gathered because of the sudden assembly called by the Grand Duchess. Some of them complain about having to attend while monsters continue appearing in the region, but soon the topic changes to Valdrova's new groom. The nobles are surprised that someone actually accepted the engagement. They start mocking him, saying that the person must be foolish to accept such a dangerous position. Others whisper that he is only a weak young man who cannot even use a sword despite coming from a noble family. Sitting at the head of the table, an old count laughs and says that the groom will not last long. Count Oliveira also believes that Ferda will eventually be destroyed by the Duchess herself. Before the meeting begins, Ferda had been reading in the library when Ruri came to inform him about the gathering. He asks if meeting the feudal lords is really necessary. Ruri explains that it is, and then tells him why Valdrova holds the title of Grand Duchess. In the past, Valdrova personally defeated the powerful black dragon Godwin, and because of that achievement, she was granted control over this territory. Ruri explains that Valdrova is currently focused on dealing with monsters, so Ferda will have to handle the internal internal affairs of the region after their marriage. While she takes care of outside threats, he will be responsible for managing the territory itself. Ferda understands that this is also a test of his ability to lead and accepts the challenge of meeting the lords. Ferda enters the meeting hall with Ruri behind him and introduces himself as the future companion of the Grand Duchess. Standing before the gathered nobles, he calmly asks them one question: how do they want him to treat them? The nobles are surprised by his direct approach. They expected the new groom to be someone easy to control, but Ferda asks them to state their position clearly. An old count smiles and explains that they are the lords who have served Valdrova for many years. He says they naturally respect the Duchess's future partner, but there are also certain things that need to be considered. He reminds Ferda that they had already pledged loyalty to the Empire long before he was born. Because of their experience and status, he suggests that Ferda should be the one showing respect toward them. Ferda listens and simply asks if that is their final answer. His cold expression makes the old count hesitate before admitting that, as the future groom, Ferda has the right to decide how he wishes to treat them. Ferda then explains that even after the marriage, the management of each territory will remain with the current lords. Nothing will change as long as they continue doing their duties. Hearing this, one of the nobles stands up angrily and asks if Ferda is accusing them of taking advantage of their own people. Ferda calmly raises his hand and apologizes, saying that it was only a mistake in his wording. His response irritates the noble even more. The man then mocks Ferda, saying he understands why the Rosnova family abandoned him. He calls him nothing more than a failed first circle mage and says that he himself is a fourth circle mage who deserves respect. Ferda only replies that being a fourth circle mage is indeed a respectable achievement. The noble becomes angry and asks if Ferda is looking down on him. He explains that fourth circle mages are respected because their magical ability gives them authority. He begins gathering his mana, intending to show Ferda the difference between their levels. Before he can do anything, Ferda raises his hand and suggests a duel. If the noble believes a first circle mage is beneath him, then they can prove it through a fight. Ferda and Thessalos enter the duel arena while the nobles watch from the side. They talk among themselves, believing the result is obvious because one of them is a first circle mage while the other is a fourth circle mage. Ruri quietly watches the match as everyone waits for the fight to begin. Inside the arena, both sides take their positions. Thessalos stands proudly while Ferda keeps his hands in his pockets and looks totally relaxed. Ferda then asks him which spell he plans to use. Thessalos is irritated by the question and calls Ferda rude for asking such a thing before the battle even begins. He smiles and tells Ferda that he can still step away if he is afraid. After that, Thessalos announces that he will use his fourth circle spell, Magic Explosion. The nobles recognize the technique and start wondering how Ferda will deal with it. Ferda does not change his expression. He simply says that he will show his own spell as well. When asked what he will use, Ferda replies that the only spell he knows is Mana Shot. Thessalos laughs when he hears that Ferda only knows Mana Shot. He finds it ridiculous that someone with such a basic spell would challenge a fourth circle mage, but Ferda says that he has no plans to lose and that he has more experience than Thessalos realizes. Angered by Ferda's attitude, Thessalos begins gathering his mana. A large magic circle forms beneath him as he prepares his fourth circle spell, Magic Explosion. While watching the spell, Ferda notices the way Thessalos is controlling his mana. He realizes that Thessalos is also using the red circle, relying on his emotions to increase his power. Before Thessalos can complete his spell, Ferda sends 3 red mana shots toward him. The attacks fly straight toward the magic circle. Thessalos tries to continue his spell, but the shots hit the weak points of the circle one after another. The magic circle starts falling apart. Thessalos cannot understand how Ferda noticed those small weaknesses so easily. He realizes that Ferda was not trying to overpower his spell, but destroy it before it could be completed. The broken magic scatters around the arena, leaving Thessalos unable to continue. He falls to the ground, struggling to breathe as his remaining mana disappears. Ferda walks toward him and asks if he admits defeat. Thessalos looks at him quietly before lowering his head. He admits that his real goal was always to become stronger and says he accepts his loss. He bows down and asks how he can obtain that kind of strength. The nobles start whispering after seeing Thessalos defeated. They cannot understand how a fourth circle mage lost against Ferda. Ruri looks at at them and warns that there is no reason to question the result. Ferda won the duel fairly. Thessalos walks toward Ferda and offers his hand. He praises Ferda's magic control and says that someone like him is a valuable person for the Eastern Territory. The mage smiles as he realizes his strength was finally acknowledged. He says that leaving the capital turned out to be a good thing for him. Ferda becomes curious when he hears about the capital and asks for his name. The man introduces himself as Thessalos Walter. After hearing the name, Ferda remembers his past life. He realizes that this was the person who once helped him. When Ferda tells him that he was his benefactor in another life, Thessalos looks confused. Before he can ask anything, Ferda places a finger on his forehead and uses Mana Shot. The spell hits Thessalos directly and sends him flying back. The nobles watch the scene without saying anything. Ferda looks at the fallen mage and thinks that he cannot let him continue living. In his previous life, Thessalos would eventually cause great trouble for Valdrova. As Ferda walks away, the nobles begin talking among themselves. They say that the duel was already over and that killing Thessalos was unnecessary. Even so, nobody steps forward to confront him. Ferda turns around and asks why they are all acting so tense. He explains that Thessalos had to be stopped because leaving him alive would bring problems for Valdrova. The old count questions how Ferda can know that when he has only met Thessalos today. Ferda answers that his bride wants humans to live peacefully. Even though she is a dragon, she fights to protect them, and Thessalos' actions went against that wish. Ferda tells the nobles that the crime he mentioned belongs to the future, so he cannot prove it right now. The nobles look at each other in confusion. Some of them start saying that he must be crazy for killing a man over something that has not happened yet. Ferda tells them that he does not care what the rest of them think. Later, the royal carriage moves along the dirt road while the evening sky turns orange. Inside the carriage, Ferda leans forward and holds his head, complaining that the ride is making him feel terrible. He used almost all of his mana during the duel, and the rough road is making the dizziness more worse. Ruri looks at him and says that he made quite an impression by killing the Duchess's most loyal lord during their very first meeting. Ferda asks if she is talking about Thessalos, and Ruri confirms it. She says that despite his flaws, Thessalos was genuinely loyal to Valdrova. Ferda asks if Thessalos was at least an honest ruler. Ruri says he was half honest and half corrupt, which is still better than most of the nobles in the region. Ferda says the engagement will continue normally because he had a good reason for killing him. He closes his eyes and starts thinking about what he remembers from his previous life. Looking at the sack that contains Thessalos' head, he remembers that the Lord should already be involved in a serious crime at this point. When they arrive at Thessalos' castle, the chief butler bows and welcomes the Duchess's envoys. He says that his master is currently away from the estate. Ferda simply tells him that Thessalos is dead. Ruri throws the sack into the butler's arms and tells him to hold it for now. Then she tells the servants to hang whatever is inside the sack, where everyone entering the castle can see it. The butler opens the sack and immediately recognizes his master's head. Ferda and Ruri walk straight into Thessalos' room and begin searching for evidence. Inside Thessalos' room, Ruri tells Ferda that they need proof that the Lord was involved in something illegal. Ferda reminds her that she was the one who carried Thessalos' head there for him. Ruri tells him to stop joking and says she will cancel the engagement if he keeps talking like that. While searching the room, Ferda notices something strange under the bed. He kneels down and runs his hand across the wooden floor, trying to find a hidden switch. Ruri gets tired of waiting and tells him to move aside. She punches the floor and breaks the wooden boards open, revealing a large hole underneath the bed. She brushes the dust off her hands and says that the passage is open now. The two of them walk down the stone staircase hidden beneath the room. When they reach the basement, both of them cover their noses because of the smell of blood and rot. The room is filled with surgical tools, monster remains, and human bodies that had been cut apart and stitched together. Ferda notices a chained soldier from the territory. Monster organs had been sewn onto the man's body, and it becomes obvious that Thessalos had been experimenting on living people. Ruri looks around the room and says that Thessalos was practically asking to be killed after doing something like this. Ruri says that this is exactly why humans cannot be trusted. Even so, she admits that what they found in the basement is enough to justify killing Thessalos. Then she turns toward Ferda and asks how he already knew about a place that had been hidden so carefully. Ferda does not answer. He keeps looking through the papers scattered across the laboratory until until he finds a particular manuscript. Holding it in his hands, he quietly says that this is what he had been searching for. The manuscript contains Thessalos's secret research, a method for infinite mana cultivation. The notes explain that monsters constantly produce mana inside their bodies. Normally, that mana is impure and cannot be used by ordinary mages, but Thessalos believed that if the same ability could be recreated artificially, it would become possible to generate pure mana endlessly and go beyond the normal limits of magic circles. Reading the manuscript brings back memories from Ferda's previous life. Thessalos had planned to use an army of undead to take revenge on the nobles who banished him to the dragon territory, and he believed this technique would eventually make him an archmage. Ferda remembers that he once wanted the same technique for himself because he thought it would help him carry out his own revenge. Now the manuscript has fallen into his hands again in this new life. He knows that studying it would help him reach the 8th circle much faster, but he stays quiet for a moment while looking at the pages, thinking about whether he should take that path again. Ruri tells Ferda that if he wants to keep the documents, nobody would ever find out. She says that this is exactly the kind of opportunity humans always chase after, but Ferda does not take the manuscript. Instead, he gives it back to her and tells her to destroy everything in this place. Ruri is surprised by his decision. She asks why a mage would throw away research that could completely change magic itself. Ferda admits that the technique is powerful, but he has no interest in keeping it. He asks her to destroy it before it causes more problems. Ruri looks at him for a moment and then agrees. She raises her hand, and blue flames begin to appear. The fire spreads through the underground laboratory, burning the documents, the research, and everything Thessalos left behind. Ferda watches the flames and remembers that the magic created from hatred always carries that same nature. Thessalos's research came from the same kind of obsession that once controlled him. He had already walked that road once before, and he does not want to repeat it. Watching the laboratory disappear into ashes, Ferda quietly says that everything has burned away properly. Ruri looks at him strangely. She still thinks he is an unusual person, but she can no longer see him as just another greedy human. She then tells him to leave the basement quickly. After all, it would be embarrassing to meet the Grand Duchess for their engagement ceremony while smelling like blood. The long-awaited day of the engagement ceremony finally arrived. While the final preparations were underway, Ruri glanced at Ferda and asked if he had finished writing the vows. Without hesitation, he held up the papers and confidently answered that everything was ready. Since each of them had written their own vows, the ceremony carried a surprisingly romantic touch for someone as powerful as the Archduke. Ruri, however, showed no interest in that sentiment. With disappointment, she remarked that calling it romantic was just a polite way of ignoring the fact that the ruler of such immense power was holding her engagement ceremony in a place that looked worse than a stable. Ferda quietly watched her reaction without arguing. He could tell she wasn't excited about the engagement itself, yet she still genuinely wanted Valdrova to be happy. Seeing her caught between those conflicting emotions made him feel a little sorry for her. Realizing he was staring, Ruri frowned and immediately told him to stop making faces before he wrinkled the formal clothes she had spent so much time preparing. Ferda simply accepted the scolding in silence, thinking it was probably better if she vented her frustration on him instead. After a brief pause, another question crossed Ferda's mind. Ever since the last summons, things had been unusually quiet, so he wondered what was happening with the Artuki territory. From what he had seen, even the noble lords looked completely incapable of managing the front lines. Ruri agreed without the slightest hesitation. She explained that the system had worked when the lords were trusted to govern their own lands, but once no one kept them in check, greed took over. They became more interested in filling their own pockets than protecting the people, and every complaint from the citizens was crushed by military force. If nothing changed, she warned, a full-scale uprising could happen at any time. Hearing that, Ferda couldn't understand why the Archduke hadn't stepped in herself. One order from someone like Valda should have been enough to bring every corrupt lord to their knees. Ruri simply told him that he would soon understand why her master refused to interfere. Without Without another explanation, she led him to the final chamber, asked him to wait, and formally announced the beginning of the engagement ceremony. The instant Ferda took his seat, an overwhelming pressure crashed down on him. Even the air flowing through the closed door felt so heavy that it seemed ready to crush his entire body. Through the narrow opening, he caught a glimpse of Archduke Valda's enormous dragon form hidden inside, and the sheer presence of that colossal body left him wondering whether someone like him truly belonged there. Standing nearby with the ceremonial drink in her hands, Ruri began reciting the ancient ritual. She declared that on this day, mortality and immortality would become one, bound together by a golden thread that neither heaven nor time itself could ever sever. She continued that the mortal would cast aside the fear of the unknown before presenting the first ceremonial drink. Ferda accepted the cup without hesitation and emptied it in a single swallow. The moment the liquid entered his body, he realized it was no ordinary drink. Almost immediately, the suffocating aura pouring from the dragon began to weaken, finally allowing him to breathe normally again. Ruri then continued with the second half of the ritual, declaring that the immortal would also become one by casting away the emptiness of endless existence. She prepared another ceremonial cup and carefully presented it toward the door. From the darkness inside, Valdrova slowly reached out with her massive dragon claws, but her body was simply too large for such a delicate task. The cup slipped from her grasp, shattered across the floor, and the ceremony came to an abrupt halt. Ruri quietly sighed before calmly announcing that they would begin again from the very start. The same ritual was repeated over and over. Every time Ferda faithfully drank another ceremonial cup, and every time Valda reached out to accept hers, the exact same accident happened. The cup slipped from her claws, broke on the floor, and the engagement ceremony failed once more. Before long, Ferda had completely lost track of how many times they had restarted. This was the first alcohol he had ever tasted in this life, yet he had already been forced to drink so much that he began worrying he might actually collapse before the ceremony was ever completed. Eventually, even Ruri's legendary patience ran out. After watching another cup shatter on the floor, the calm expression she had maintained throughout the ceremony finally disappeared. Barely holding back her frustration, she excused herself and stepped inside the chamber where Valdrova was waiting. The door had barely closed behind her before she completely lost her composure. Raising her voice, she yelled at her master, demanding to know what she was doing. After all, it had been Valdrova herself who stubbornly insisted on marrying a mortal in the first place, yet she couldn't even manage to hold a single ceremonial cup. No matter how nervous she was, hiding away would only make Ferda look like he was being ignored. If she truly wanted to marry him, then she needed to step outside and welcome him properly. If she dropped the engagement wine again, she would not let it pass this time. Unfortunately for Valdrova, Ferda had been standing right outside the entire time. Every single word from Ruri's angry lecture reached his ears. Hearing her shout at her master with such confidence left him completely frozen. A few moments later, Ruri calmly walked back outside as if nothing had happened and asked him, "Did you hear that just now?" Still trying to process what he had witnessed, Ferda admitted that he did. He even joked that her roar was powerful enough to rival a dragon's breath. Ruri simply nodded and explained that there was no other choice if they wanted the ceremony to continue. The reason was simple. Her master was afraid of humans. Ferda looked at her in disbelief. The great Archduke Valdrova, someone feared across the world, was actually afraid of humans? Ruri explained that Valdrova avoided human contact whenever possible. In fact, she rarely left her lair unless she was going out to hunt monsters. Hearing this, Ferda couldn't believe what he was learning. The mighty dragon he had always feared had a weakness like this. But then another question came to his mind. If she was too afraid to come outside, how were they supposed to finish the engagement ceremony? Before he could think of an answer, a huge hand slowly appeared from behind the door. The massive entrance began opening, and for the first time, Archduke Valdrova stepped outside in her true dragon form. Even after finally appearing, she remained silent and quietly took her place. Ferda could only stare at the enormous dragon standing before him. He noticed that her face was still covered, and he couldn't help but think about the difference between what he had imagined and what he was seeing. He had always heard that a dragon's transformed appearance was unbelievably beautiful, but right now, she looked less like a bride and more like a warrior preparing to enter a battlefield. Once everyone was ready again, Ruri continued the ceremony without mentioning what had happened. She began reciting the ancient vows, saying that the mortal and immortal would become one by leaving behind their fears and the emptiness of endless existence. After finishing the ritual words, she poured the ceremonial wine into the cups prepared for both Ferda and Valdrova. This time, when it was Valdrova's turn to drink, she slowly moved aside the armor covering her face. The moment Ferda saw her appearance beneath it, he completely froze. The image of the terrifying dragon he had built in his mind disappeared instantly. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. For a moment, he even wondered if the wine had affected him. The fear that had been controlling him was gone. Instead, he was looking at a woman who was far different from the monster he had imagined. The great Valdrova had gone through all of this just to marry an ordinary human like him. Ruri continued the ceremony and announced that it was now time for them to read the vows they had written for each other. Ferda looked down at the paper in his hands. After returning to the past, the words written there no longer felt the same, but after a short hesitation, he decided to read them anyway. He said that although Valdrova didn't know much about him, he already knew everything about her. Through the heart she had once given him, he had seen all the pain she endured. He had watched her get betrayed, framed, and misunderstood again and again. Yet despite everything, she continued carrying out her responsibilities with pride. She even accepted those who hated her without reason and refused to abandon the things she cared about. Because of that, Ferda made his vow. Just as she had once given her heart to him, this time he would give his heart to her, to his sovereign, and to the person who meant everything to him. After finishing the prepared vows, Ferda smiled and added one more thing that wasn't written on the paper. He said that it was truly an honor to become engaged to such a beautiful woman. Even after hearing those words, Ruri's expression remained calm. She simply nodded and announced that it was now time for the bride's vows. However, before she could finish speaking, something unexpected happened. Valdrova suddenly stood up. Without saying a single word, she turned around and quickly returned behind the door. Both Ferda and Ruri were left speechless by her reaction. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then Ruri smiled and calmly announced that the engagement ceremony was complete. From behind the closed door, Valdrova's embarrassed voice could be heard. She apologized and asked if she could remain hidden inside her room for the next 3 days. Hearing this, Ruri walked inside with a huge smile on her face. She praised her master for making such a perfect move against that arrogant man. According to her, this was proof of Valdrova's true dragon-like elegance. She laughed while saying that her master must have planned everything from the beginning, because even she had been fooled by that unexpected retreat. With that single move, Valdrova had taken complete control of the situation. Valdrova looked completely different from the Archduke everyone feared. Instead of her usual calm and powerful expression, her face was bright red, and she couldn't even bring herself to look at anyone after hearing Ferda's confession. After a while, she quietly admitted that she had actually prepared her own vows. She wanted to welcome her fiancé properly and say the words she had written herself. Hearing that, Ruri looked confused and asked why she didn't say them then. Valdrova lowered her head and explained the reason. The moment she looked at Ferda, she couldn't think of anything. His eyes felt like they could see right through her, and his calm voice made it even harder for her to stay composed. All the words she had prepared disappeared, leaving her unable to say a single thing. Ruri sighed after hearing that. She admitted that even her own mind was starting to go blank from watching this happen. But then her expression became serious. She apologized for bringing up such a topic on a happy day, but she told Valdrova that she needed to be prepared for disappointment. Confused, Valdrova asked what she meant. Ruri explained that Ferda was now officially her fiancé. Since he would be acting as the Archduke's representative and managing the Eastern Territory, he would also hold great authority. But humans often changed after gaining power. She reminded Valdrova of what happened with the Third Imperial Prince in the past. Ruri apologized for bringing back painful memories from many years ago, but she believed this was the most honest advice she could give. Valdrova remained silent for a moment before answering that she understood. Mortals were destined to disappear one day. Perhaps it would be better to bury this unfamiliar feeling before it became something she couldn't control. Although her words sounded calm, there was a quiet sadness behind them. It felt less like she was telling Ruri her thoughts, and more like she was trying to convince herself. After the engagement ceremony ended, Ferda returned to his room and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Even now, he still found it strange. He had really become become engaged to the great Valdrova. In his previous life, hatred had filled his entire existence. He had been so focused on revenge that he never had the chance to feel anything else. But this time was different. Ever since that moment, he kept thinking about it again and again. His red circle was reacting violently. A red circle that lost control could eventually destroy its own caster. But if someone learned how to control that unstable power, it could become an opportunity for unbelievable growth. Ferda had already reached the peak of magic once in his previous life. Returning there was no longer an impossible dream. A magic circle needed two things to grow: mana and mental strength. Right now, as only a first circle mage, his mana was still limited, but his mental strength was different. After reaching the level of an archmage once before, his mind was already strong enough. Looking at the wild mana inside his body, Ferda made his decision. He would control it. He carefully guided every bit of mana and forced the chaotic energy into the shape he wanted. Using Spellblower, he continued refining the power until the unstable mana began forming a new circle. Second circle. With this, Ferda had taken another step closer to her. 3 days later, Ruri visited him and immediately noticed the change. She couldn't hide her surprise when she learned that he had reached the second circle in only 3 days. She asked if red circle mages normally grew this quickly. Ferda simply answered that it depended on the person, but inside, he knew the real reason. The red circle had a dangerous side effect. Every time it created a new circle, it demanded a stronger emotional stimulus. Eventually, the strongest emotion that awakened the circle could become a permanent part of the caster's personality. In his previous life, that emotion had been hatred. Even after getting his revenge, he couldn't escape it. He kept searching for more things to hate because his circle had already been shaped by that feeling. Remembering that past only strengthened Ferda's determination. He would not allow the same thing to happen again. Not long after, Ruri guided him through the fortress and stopped in front of a large room. "This will be your office from now on, Sir Ferda. You will work here while serving as the Grand Duke's regent." Ferda entered the room and quietly looked around. Even though this was a dragon's fortress, everything inside had clearly been arranged with a human in mind. The details, the furniture, and the overall setup showed that Valdrova had put real thought into preparing a place for her fiancé. Seeing that, Ferda understood how much effort she had made for him. Without wasting time, he straightened himself and began his first duty as the Archduke's representative. The situation was clear. Valdrova's territory had been neglected for too long. However, after Ferda exposed Thessalos's crimes and displayed his head before the nobles, the other lords had become careful around him. With Ruri's help, handling the internal affairs would be much easier. His first move was to send letters to the lords he had met before. While watching him write, Ruri asked what he planned to say in his first official message. Ferda answered simply. He would tell them that from now on, they would be working together. Since he would be handling internal affairs as the regent, anyone who disagreed did not need to send a reply. He respected their decision. The letters were delivered throughout the territory, and the matter of the nobles was temporarily settled. Now Ferda could focus on the next major problem: the monsters. These creatures destroyed fertile land just by existing, and had caused countless deaths among ordinary people. Valdrova was constantly occupied with disaster-class monsters, but even someone as powerful as her couldn't eliminate every weaker monster spread across such a massive territory. Sitting in his office, Ferda considered the situation. The first thing he needed was capable people. When Ruri asked if he already had someone in mind, Ferda handed her a document filled with names. After making the list, Ferda and Ruri left the castle and started looking for the first person he wanted to recruit. While walking, Ruri looked at the paper again and still couldn't understand his choice. They had to personally search for their first candidate, and that person was some unknown scholar she had never even heard of. Their journey eventually brought them to Eskla, a famous city filled with scholars and students. As they walked through the crowded streets, Ferda explained that it made sense why Ruri didn't know him. The person on the list was someone who had not revealed his talent to the world yet. Ruri remained doubtful. She reminded Ferda that choosing the wrong person to handle government affairs could create serious problems. Looking at the list again, she asked if he had simply written down random names. Ferda calmly denied it and explained that although the list looked simple, collecting this information had taken him a long time. While saying that, he remembered remembered his past. This list was not originally made to find talented people. In his previous life, it was a list of people he wanted to destroy. He had studied their achievements and weaknesses because he wanted to find reasons to hate them and eventually take revenge. Back then, hatred controlled his thoughts, and he was always searching for another target. Now, looking back, he realized how unreasonable he had become. Those memories reminded him why he needed to be careful in this life and not become the same person again. As they continued walking through Eskla, a shopkeeper called out to them and offered some snacks. Ferda approached the stall and asked if many academy graduates visited the area. The shopkeeper proudly said yes, explaining that although his shop looked ordinary, he had been running it for many years. Hearing that, Ferda asked if he knew someone called the Messy Scholar. The shopkeeper laughed at the nickname and joked whether Ferda planned to turn his castle into a mess. He admitted that the nickname was well known, but because he was busy with his business, he couldn't remember every person who passed by. Before leaving, Ferda asked the price. The shopkeeper replied that 3 skewers cost 5 copper coins. While paying, Ferda noticed that Ruri had been staring at the skewers the entire time. Without saying anything, he bought them and handed them to her. Seeing her reaction, he smiled and said he never expected her to like this kind of food. Ruri quickly looked away and replied that she only bought them because they needed information. However, her expression made it obvious that she actually wanted to eat them. As they walked through the city, Ferda quietly looked at Ruri and thought about how different she was from what he expected. He once believed that someone who experienced as much as he did would lose their emotions completely, but Ruri could still show simple reactions and even get excited over something as small as food. When she noticed him looking at her, she misunderstood his reason and became slightly embarrassed, moving a little away from him. Without saying anything else, the two continued searching for their target. Elsewhere, a man was frantically trying to gather the research papers that had been scattered by the wind. At the same time, Veritas Academy was holding its 525th graduation ceremony. Among the students leaving the academy was Burnell Marquis, a scholar whose reputation had taken a strange turn. He had entered as the academy's greatest freshman, but was now leaving with the title of its worst graduate. His graduation should have been a proud moment, but instead of celebrating with his classmates, Burnell found himself surrounded by several men who had come to collect what he owed them. Their congratulations were nothing more than an excuse to remind him that his years of promises were over. Burnell could only laugh awkwardly, knowing that nearly everything he owned was already tied up in debt. The men had visited his house countless times demanding repayment, yet every time, Burnell had managed to convince them to give him a little longer. They had tolerated it for years because he kept insisting that once his research was finished, everything would change. Their patience was wearing thin, especially when one of them caught a terrible smell nearby and traced it to what looked like a dead animal. Burnell quickly stepped in to explain that the corpse belonged to a monster. His research was based on finding a way to extract value from creatures that were normally considered useless after death, turning their remains into mana stones and other forms of energy. The work was extremely difficult because the materials he needed were rare, but Burnell believed the result could transform the way the entire continent produced energy. The boss, however, had heard enough promises. He reminded Burnell that this was the very breakthrough he'd been talking about for years, yet none of it had put a single coin in their pockets. When Burnell admitted that his research still wasn't ready because too many problems remained, the man's patience disappeared. He mocked Burnell for being brilliant inside a classroom, but clueless about making a living in the real world, then offered him a much more profitable alternative: weapons research. Burnell had once been the academy's top freshman, so the boss expected him to use that talent to create something people would actually pay for. The moment the boss produced a dagger, Burnell knew the conversation was heading somewhere bad. He hurriedly mentioned that he had another research proposal, but the man hurled the dagger into the ground between Burnell's legs before he could explain himself. Burnell cried out, while the boss reminded him that he'd already been more patient than he needed to be. A heavily indebted researcher wasn't exactly in a position to turn down every opportunity handed to him. Burnell pleaded that weapons were something he simply couldn't work on and begged for another option, but the boss had reached his limit. He knocked Burnell down and demanded to know why the man kept rejecting everything they offered. After years of waiting and receiving nothing in return, the boss finally told him to die. To loan sharks, every coin mattered, and they weren't willing to keep wasting time on someone who couldn't repay them. The men closed in on Burnell and began beating him. He tried to shield himself and desperately begged them to stay away from his head, but there was little he could do against several men at once. As the assault continued, Burnell genuinely began to wonder whether this was where his life would end. That's when an unfamiliar voice cut through the commotion and ordered them to stop. The newcomer was Ferda, who calmly explained that he'd come looking for Burnell because he had business with him. The loan shark boss took one look at Ferda and assumed he was some wealthy young man from elsewhere. He wondered whether Burnell had borrowed money from him too, but Ferda denied it. The boss told him to wait until they were finished, saying he would leave Burnell conscious enough to speak before dealing with anything else. Ferda, however, pointed out that keeping Burnell's mouth working wasn't what mattered to him. What Ferda wanted was Burnell's brain. Rather than argue with the loan sharks, Ferda offered to settle Burnell's debt himself. The boss named the price, 72 gold coins once the interest was included, and clearly wasn't convinced that Ferda could produce such an amount. Ferda didn't bother arguing. He simply set down a bag packed with gleaming gold and told them it was more than enough. The sight of the money changed the atmosphere immediately. The loan sharks stared at the fortune in front of them, while their boss looked over at Burnell with a grin, realizing that the supposedly hopeless scholar had somehow found himself a wealthy patron. He happily declared the debt settled and reached toward the payment. That was when Ruri caught his hand. She reminded him that their business wasn't over and questioned why he thought he could simply take the money. The boss grimaced as her grip tightened and accused Ferda of changing their agreement. Ferda calmly reminded him of exactly what he had come for, Burnell's brain. But after seeing what the loan sharks had done to Burnell, Ferda had a problem. If the man's brain had been damaged, then the merchandise they'd been paid to provide was no longer in proper condition. In Ferda's mind, that meant the loan sharks owed compensation for damaging what he had purchased. Burnell, meanwhile, could only sit there badly beaten and completely bewildered by the conversation taking place around him. The boss couldn't believe what he was hearing and angrily pointed out that Burnell was a human being, not some piece of merchandise. He also struggled to understand how Ruri, a girl, could hold his hand with that kind of strength. Eventually, she released him, leaving him nursing his aching wrist. Ferda then told Ruri that he was counting on her, but she calmly observed that judging by how things had turned out, she probably wouldn't even need to get involved. Ruri finally let her mana loose. The pressure spreading from her was so heavy that the loan sharks could barely move, and the boss could only stare at her while trying to figure out what kind of magic he was dealing with. Ferda didn't waste any time arguing with them. He gave them two ways to settle things. They could pay for what they'd done to Burnell, or they could take the same beating they had just given him. Since these men were loan sharks who hated losing money more than anything, Ferda already knew which option they'd choose, and sure enough, he decided they would be paying their debt with their own bodies. Ruri then went through the group one by one, beating them down until none of them had the strength to resist. Their cries filled the area while she dealt with each of them, and before long, the men who had been acting so threatening earlier were scrambling to get away. Once the loan sharks were gone, Burnell finally had a chance to breathe. He looked at Ferda and Ruri and thanked them sincerely for saving him, admitting that he had no idea how he could ever repay them. He then introduced himself properly as Burnell Marque, the scholar known as the Messy Scholar, before asking Ferda who he was. Ferda gave him his full name, Ferda Drova. Burnell froze as soon as he heard it. He quickly knelt down after realizing that the man standing in front of him was the Grand Duke's husband and apologized for failing to recognize him. Ferda told him there was no need to apologize. Given the circumstances, it wasn't surprising that Burnell hadn't known who he was. More importantly, Ferda hadn't come there just to deal with the loan sharks. He had specifically specifically sought Burnell out because he'd heard about his research. That alone was enough to catch Burnell off guard. For years, people had treated his research like a useless obsession, so hearing that someone had actually taken an interest in it left him struggling to believe what he was hearing. Ferda explained that he knew Burnell was working on ways to make use of monster corpses. He also knew exactly where Burnell would have the best chance of continuing that work: the Far East. Monsters were everywhere there, which meant Burnell would have access to more research material than he could ever hope to find elsewhere. Ferda invited him to Castle Drova and promised to provide whatever was necessary for the research: materials, money, equipment, facilities. Burnell wouldn't have to worry about any of it, and Ferda wouldn't place unnecessary restrictions on his work either. Burnell was practically glowing after hearing that. Just moments ago, he had been getting beaten by loan sharks, and now someone was offering to give him everything he'd ever needed for his research. He became so excited that Rory quietly told Ferda she was starting to wonder if Burnell was actually sane. Ferda let Burnell enjoy himself for a moment before mentioning that there was one condition. If Burnell accepted all this support, then he would also have to develop weapons through his research. That was enough to bring Burnell back to reality. He refused straight away. He had no interest in creating weapons because, to him, weapons only existed to kill people and destroy peace. His goal had always been to keep the land peaceful, not contribute to another source of violence. Ferda understood where Burnell was coming from, but he asked him to look at the situation from another side. The monsters Burnell was studying weren't harmless creatures. In the Far East, even one of them could kill countless people. Ferda then told Burnell what life on the front lines was really like. Every 3 days, the Grand Duke herself went out to fight the giant monsters gathering there. Some of those creatures were powerful enough to wipe out a city like Eskla, yet she continued facing them directly, putting her own life at risk each time. Most people never saw any of this. They simply went about their lives, enjoying the peace around them without knowing what the Grand Duke had to endure to keep it that way. Ferda wasn't asking Burnell to make weapons because he wanted to start a war. He needed someone who could create something powerful enough to kill those monsters and take some of that burden away from the Grand Duke. That was why Ferda wanted Burnell. The same scholar everyone had dismissed as a failure was being offered a position as the chief researcher of Castle Drova. Ferda even handed him an official appointment letter to prove that he was serious. Burnell stared at the document, unable to give an answer right away. The offer was everything a researcher could dream of, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that creating weapons with his own hands went against everything he believed in. Still, this would only be the beginning of Burnell's story. The scholar who had once been mocked for his research would eventually become known as Messi Burnell Marque, the genius whose work would help bring about the age of magical engineering. Ferda already knew how Burnell's story would turn out. The scholar who hated the idea of weapons would eventually become someone willing to fight a war himself if that was what it took to preserve peace. For now, though, there was nothing more Ferda could do. He and Rory left Burnell's home and headed back toward the palace in their carriage. During the ride, Ferda mentioned that Burnell still hadn't given them a clear answer. Rory pointed out that he probably needed some time to think, and Ferda wasn't worried about it. If Burnell decided to accept, he would come looking for them once he'd made up his mind. Rory, meanwhile, had other things on her mind. Ferda noticed she'd become rather fond of the snacks they kept finding during their travels. She was still working on a honey-glazed fruit stick, as she explained that she was only eating because she was hungry, especially with plenty of road still ahead. Their next stop wasn't going to be a casual visit either. They were searching for someone from the Red-Eyed tribe, a race whose eyes could dispel magic circles. That ability had made them the natural enemies of wizards, and over the years, they had been persecuted until the tribe was believed to have disappeared completely. Rory was surprised that anyone from that bloodline could still be alive. Ferda agreed that such a person could be extremely useful, although actually finding one wouldn't be easy. Someone from a supposedly extinct race would have every reason to stay hidden. Ferda checked how much money they had left for the journey, and Rory assured him that they still had enough to fill an entire cart. That was plenty for their next destination, Halim. The moment Ferda mentioned the city's name, Rory went stiff. Her face lost its color as she realized where they were headed. Halim had had a reputation for being a city built around corruption, pleasure, and all sorts of questionable entertainment. Ferda, however, had no intention of changing their plans. The person they were looking for was a gambler, so naturally, Halim was exactly where they needed to go. Not long after, they arrived at one of the city's casinos. Downstairs, men and women dressed in expensive evening clothes were gathered around green felt tables, while black and white-clad attendants moved between them. This wasn't some ordinary gambling hall. It was a private gathering for people with enough money to treat huge sums of gold like pocket change. At one table, a well-dressed man sat surrounded by several women, while an enormous pile of gold poker coins covered the surface. Then Ferda and Ruri appeared carrying an equally enormous box of their own. The sight of that much gold being brought into the room caused quite a stir. People began whispering about where they had gotten it and whether Ferda had brought his entire fortune with him. The amount was so ridiculous that some people realized it was close to what an entire territory could spend in a year. Ferda and Ruri took the box over to the wealthy man, who looked at them with curiosity. Ruri quietly pointed out that his eyes weren't red, but Ferda assured her that they had found the right person. The man soon figured out who they were looking for and introduced himself as Jed Swallow. Rather than asking why they were there, he simply invited them to sit down and play. New opponents were always welcome at his table. This carefree man was exactly the person Ferda had come to recruit. Ferda joined the game, and after a few rounds, he managed to beat Jed. Jed took the loss in good humor and congratulated him on the win. One of the women beside him, apparently his girlfriend, questioned why he hadn't taken the game seriously. Jed just laughed it off, saying that luck couldn't favor him every time. He even joked that perhaps he would play better if the woman beside him gave him a little encouragement. Watching him closely, Ferda realized that gambling wasn't really what interested Jed. Most of his attention was on the noble woman beside him and figuring out how to charm her. He had all the qualities that made nobles fond of him: an easy tongue, a handsome face, and surprisingly good sleight of hand. He carried himself like someone who had grown up surrounded by wealth. But Ferda also noticed another side to him. If things ever turned dangerous, Jed looked like the sort of man who would disappear before anyone could catch him. So Ferda decided he wouldn't give him that chance. They started another round. Jed casually remarked that the young master seemed to be getting better at the game, and Ferda admitted that he was having a good time. Jed laughed and said they should do this again sometime. Ferda's response made it clear that wasn't going to happen. He pointed out that it would be troublesome if the woman standing behind him started believing he was some kind of gambler. Jed laughed again, saying he'd heard that excuse from plenty of men before. He understood why Ferda wanted to keep up appearances in front of a woman, but he was still curious about what had actually brought him into this place. Ferda sighed before giving him the answer. He was looking for Amelia. The name changed the mood around the table. Everyone reacted to the revelation, and Jed immediately understood that Ferda hadn't come here simply for a game. Something darker was behind his visit. Anger began to build beneath Jed's smile, but he kept his expression relaxed and started asking whether Ferda intended to do something reckless. Ferda didn't let him finish. He calmly pushed forward and declared that he was going all in. Ferda put everything he had into the pot. The entire casino went quiet for a moment before whispers started spreading from one end of the room to the other. Nobody could believe the newcomer had actually thrown his whole fortune into a single game against Jed. Even Jed's smile became a little more restrained. Whatever Ferda was planning, Jed knew he couldn't afford to lose this hand, so he accepted the challenge. The cards were revealed, and Ferda had a straight flush. Ruri could hardly believe what she was seeing, while Ferda simply sat there with a calm smile. But the result didn't go his way. Despite Ferda's strong hand, Jed somehow took the round. His relaxed expression disappeared right after the win, and the brown eyes he'd been showing everyone were replaced by a pair of unmistakably red eyes. Jed asked Ferda and Ruri to come somewhere quieter because there were things they needed to talk about. The three of them ended up at a nearby restaurant. Jed poured himself a drink, but there was nothing playful about him anymore. He wanted to know how Ferda knew about Amelia and whether he had any connection to the men who had been after them. His patience was already running thin, and he demanded to know where his sister was. Ferda immediately understood that the brown eyes Jed had been displaying at the casino were simply part of his disguise. He also made one thing clear. He had nothing to do with the thugs Jed was talking about. Instead, Ferda explained what he had figured out about Jed. To the nobles, Jed was nothing more than an entertaining gambler gambler who spent his days drinking and playing games with wealthy women. But Ferda knew that image was carefully constructed. Jed's sleight of hand was good enough to clean out an entire casino if he actually wanted to. Even his habit of lowering himself to entertaining nobles with cheap rum had a purpose. Jed had been using those connections to get closer to the people who might know something about his missing sister. He knew Jed was building connections in high society because he was desperately searching for Amelia. The Swallow siblings had been caught in the middle of a conflict simply because they belonged to the Red-Eyed tribe. Some wizards wanted their race wiped out, while groups opposed to wizards wanted to exploit the abilities of their bloodline. Somewhere in the middle of all that, Jed had lost his sister. Since then, he had hidden who he really was and worked his way into noble society, hoping someone there could help him find Amelia. But the nobles he'd surrounded himself with never saw him as anything more than entertainment. They enjoyed his company, his tricks, and his gambling, but none of them had any intention of actually helping him. Ferda pointed out that Jed could keep throwing money around and entertaining nobles for years, but he wasn't going to find his sister that way. Jed rubbed his forehead, frustrated and exhausted. He still had no idea where Amelia was, and now Ferda had uncovered his identity as well. But Ferda wasn't there to expose him. He offered Jed another option. Introducing himself properly, Ferda explained that as the future husband of Valdrova, he was willing to take Jed on as his attendant. Jed immediately reacted to the name Valdrova. He looked at Ferda suspiciously, wondering whether he was seriously offering such a position to someone like him. The proposal was strange enough on its own, but the idea of hiring the kept man of a red dragon made it even harder to believe. Ferda assured him that he was completely serious, and Ruri handed him the appointment letter. If Jed still doubted him, Ferda told him to read it himself. Working for him would give Jed exactly what he had been missing: a legitimate way into high society and a much better chance of tracking down Amelia. Jed thought it over carefully. An opportunity like this didn't come along every day, but he wasn't about to trust Ferda without setting a few rules of his own. His first condition was simple: he wanted proper pay for his work. He needed money after all. The second was more important. If Ferda ever tried to use his red-eyed abilities for some hidden purpose, Jed would walk away immediately. He briefly considered adding another condition, but decided against it and agreed to the offer as long as Ferda accepted those two terms. Ferda agreed, but he had a condition of his own. Their agreement would only last until Jed found Amelia. Once his sister was found, Jed would be free to decide for himself whether he wanted to continue working for Ferda or leave. Jed actually stood up in disbelief and slapped a hand onto the table. He had expected some kind of trap. Instead, Ferda was telling him that he could simply walk away when the contract ended. There would be no attempt to sell him, enslave him, or keep him by force. Ferda calmly explained that he had no interest in buying or selling people. Once their agreement was over, Jed would be free. That only made Jed more confused. He pointed out that Ferda was a wizard and asked whether he wasn't worried about having a member of the Red-Eyed tribe walking around openly. After all, their eyes were supposed to be the natural counter to magic. Ferda found the concern amusing. In his view, a wizard who was afraid of someone simply because his magic wouldn't work on them wasn't much of a wizard to begin with. He also had no intention of forcing Jed to remain with him. Besides, Ferda already knew that trying to hold Jed against his will wouldn't work. In the future, this man would become a master thief who escaped even the most notorious prisons again and again. Jed took another drink and shook his head. Ferda was certainly an unusual noble. After thinking things over, Jed finally decided to give the job a try and agreed to become his attendant. Then Ferda revealed what his very first assignment would be. As the future husband of the Grand Duchess, Ferda wanted Jed to seduce a woman and bring her back with him. Jed nearly choked on his beer. The beer came flying out of his mouth as he stared at Ferda in disbelief. Ferda, however, acted as though he'd just assigned him an ordinary task. With Jed's skills, he shouldn't have much trouble. All he needed to do was bring back one woman who lived alone. And with that rather unusual first mission given to their newest recruit, the scene moved elsewhere. Deep within a secluded forest, the night sky takes on an unusual purple hue as a flock of blackbirds passes over the treetops. Hidden beneath the dense woods sits a small wooden house, isolated from the outside world and carrying an unsettling presence. This is where the three have finally arrived, the home of the witch they came to meet. Jed recognizes the place and starts wondering whether stepping into a witch's territory is really a good idea. He has heard enough stories about people whose lives were ruined after getting involved with witches, yet he knows he has to see this request through. Before entering, he turns to Ferda and asks about his reward for completing the first request. Ferda reminds him that the money he won at the casino was already his payment. Jed isn't willing to accept that so easily, arguing that the casino winnings came from his own ability and therefore shouldn't be treated as a mission fee. Ruri's expression makes it clear that continuing this argument would be a bad idea. She reminds him that the money was specifically meant as his payment and looks ready to settle the matter herself. Jed quickly gives up and accepts that his first request being free isn't such a terrible deal after all. He then brushes off the situation with his usual confidence, pointing out how amusing it is that his very first assignment has turned into a seduction job. Since charming people happens to be what he considers one of his strongest talents, he tells the others to sit back and watch. Jed walks into the witch's house and closes the door behind him. Ruri watches the door after Jed disappears inside and tells Ferda that he has gone in. She still can't understand why Ferda decided to bring them to a place like this, especially when there is a chance Jed could come back out dead. Ferda, however, doesn't share her concern. He explains that Jed was given a task suited perfectly to his abilities, so there shouldn't be any reason to expect the worst. Ruri points out that the problem goes far beyond Jed's ability to handle the assignment. The woman inside belongs to the Philia family, and sending a man directly into the home of one of their witches is asking for trouble. According to Ruri, there is little chance Jed will walk back out unharmed. The Philias are infamous as Red Circle witches, women associated with hatred and desire. Bound together as sisters by a curse, they depend on one another while carrying an intense resentment toward men. Ferda remains composed and explains that Echidna is not exactly welcomed among them anyway. In fact, she was branded a heretic even within the Philia clan. Ruri finds that difficult to believe and asks whether a witch can truly be treated as a heretic by her own kind. Ferda confirms that Echidna's case is different, explaining that the very reason she was cast out is what made it possible for them to recruit her. Ruri starts to ask whether that particular reason is the one she has in mind, but before she can finish, the house door opens. Jed steps outside looking thoroughly worn out, and when he calls for Sir Ferda, even his voice sounds strained. He admits that the encounter ended much sooner than expected. According to him, Echidna became willing to cooperate because she was captivated by his appearance and said she would do anything for him. Even Jed seems unsure whether this outcome was really what they were supposed to achieve. The answer is standing right behind him. Echidna Philyas, the witch known as the Heretic of Fiaz, is holding on to Jed while staring at his handsome face with complete fascination. Her reason for being branded a heretic now becomes clear. Echidna has an overwhelming obsession with attractive faces, and when she notices Ferda, another handsome man standing nearby, her attention shifts toward him just as strongly. She becomes excited at the sight and even starts drooling, as though Ferda were some irresistible delicacy. Echidna happily welcomes Ferda and Ruri as well, delighted that her home has suddenly been visited by several handsome men and a lovely girl. The four of them settle down together inside the house. Echidna introduces herself with great enthusiasm and can hardly contain her happiness at having such handsome gentlemen and such a cute lady visit her humble home. Her excitement turns into delighted laughter, while Jed sits there struggling to process the bizarre behavior unfolding around him. Ferda doesn't waste time with the introductions and brings up the real reason for their visit. He addresses Echidna Falaz and tells her that he has heard rumors about a special golem she has been working on. The moment he mentions it, Echidna becomes embarrassed, clearly uncomfortable that someone has discovered her secret project. She wants to know how Ferda learned about it, but instead of explaining, he asks her to show them the golem. Echidna refuses at once, insisting that nobody is supposed to know about her creation. Ferda simply turns away and tells the others that there is nothing they can do if she refuses, meaning they will have to leave. That possibility is more than Echidna can tolerate. She realizes she is about to lose the chance to spend time with these beautiful visitors, people she feels she hasn't encountered in ages. Unable to let them walk away, she finally changes her mind and agrees to reveal the golem. Echidna leads the group toward her creation, but when they finally see it, the result is far beyond what they expected. Instead of having the ordinary appearance one would associate with a golem, the creature possesses an extraordinarily handsome handsome face. Jed takes one look at it and points out that Echidna must have devoted an enormous amount of effort to making the face so attractive. Embarrassed by the observation, Echidna admits that the golem isn't finished yet. She then proudly explains that her goal is to create her own ultimate form of beauty before showing them the different details she has put into the creation. While Echidna is presenting her masterpiece, the golem moves right up beside her. Getting such a close look at its handsome face has an unexpected effect on Echidna herself. The woman who created it becomes captivated by her own creation, and her face turns red as she finds herself falling for the beauty she made with her own hands. Jed, Ferda, and Ruri are left standing there with no idea how to react to what they have just witnessed. Ruri, in particular, is still trying to make sense of the strange behavior and asks what exactly the golem had been doing just moments earlier. Echidna explains that the golem had not been moving toward her without reason. It had been observing her emotional state and deciding what kind of tea would suit her at that particular moment. Ruri finds this remarkable because an ordinary golem should never possess such an advanced level of learning or independence. This creation can recognize its master's mood, make its own judgment, and act according to what it observes. As they discuss its ability, the golem returns carrying a freshly prepared cup of tea for Echidna. She happily realizes that it must have sensed she was in a good mood and selected the drink accordingly. The tea is Darjeeling, a black tea originating from Darjeeling, India. Ruri watches the entire process and quietly tells Ferda that Echidna clearly isn't some ordinary golem creator. She then realizes that Ferda had known this from the beginning. Echidna's real specialty is something far rarer. She is a rune maker, one of fewer than 10 such artisans known across the entire continent. Runes form the foundation of magic circles, and while ordinary wizards can combine already existing runes to produce their spells, a rune maker possesses the ability to create the precise runes required for a specific purpose. That is the true extent of Echidna's talent. Curious about how someone with such an unusual ability ended up making golems, Ruri asks Echidna about it. Echidna explains with a smile that her red circle awakened because of her desire for handsome men. Ruri has no idea how to respond to such an explanation. Echidna continues, revealing that she had always wanted a boyfriend, but for some reason, she could never manage to date anyone. The other witch sisters had their own methods of dealing with men, but their approaches were far more frightening. Some would preserve living men as taxidermy, while others would destroy their minds and turn them into puppets. Echidna admits that she found those methods far too gruesome for her liking. Jed listens to this explanation while visibly trembling, clearly wanting no part in the practices of the other witches. Ferda, on the other hand, pays close attention as Echidna reveals what she did instead. Rather than finding a man, she simply used her rune-making talent to create herself a boyfriend. Ferda's expression changes when he realizes what she has accomplished. Even as an archmage, rune-making is a skill beyond his own abilities, yet Echidna had used it to create something specifically for herself. Despite how bizarre the purpose may be, Ferda recognizes that her talent could be extremely valuable for another reason. Echidna notices Ferda's reaction and wonders what he is thinking. Instead of explaining, Ferda takes out an appointment letter and presents it to her. He officially offers Echidna Falaz the second position as chief researcher, inviting her to accompany them to the Grand Duchess's territory and continue her research there. Echidna is thrilled by the proposal and accepts without hesitation, promising to follow them wherever they go. Her enthusiasm has a very simple reason. The new territory will apparently contain plenty of handsome men. For Echidna, that alone is enough to make the offer irresistible. With their newest member recruited, the group of 4 prepares to leave together. Ferda reflects on how far their recruitment has progressed. He has now assembled the research specialists required for the Grand Duchess's territory. Burnell will take responsibility for magical engineering, while Echidna will concentrate on her golem soldiers. With 2 such unusual specialists working on these projects, Ferda begins to believe that they may eventually reach a point where the monsters can be driven completely away from the Far East front line. Not long afterward, the 4 begin getting into the carriage. Jed happily bids farewell to the gloomy forest, pleased that their assignment has finally reached its conclusion. Before they depart, Ferda asks Echidna whether she has finished gathering all of her belongings. Echidna cheerfully assures him that everything has been packed properly. She has even prepared her luggage using subspace storage magic. Jed gives her an uneasy look and urges her to stop taking so long and get inside the carriage. Ferda, Ferda, however, picks up on something important from what Echidna has just demonstrated. Anyone capable of using subspace storage magic must possess at least the abilities of a fifth circle witch. Along with that discovery, Ferda is once again reminded just how extreme Echidna's fixation on handsome men really is. For now, he decides it would be wise to keep a countermeasure close by, in case her obsession causes trouble. He then gives Jed and Echidna their next instruction. They are to head back to Valdrova's castle first. Jed can hardly believe what he has just heard. Echidna, meanwhile, reacts with even more enthusiasm at the idea of heading there. Jed asks Ferda why he isn't coming along with them, but Ferda explains that he will remain in the area and return the following day. Jed suggests that he should at least bring an attendant along, yet Ferda turns down the suggestion, saying there is no reason for it when he intends to return tomorrow anyway. Jed tries to persuade him not to leave them on their own, but Ferda has already made up his mind. Echidna is far less concerned about being separated from him. Instead, her attention is focused on the Grand Duchess's castle, and she excitedly wonders whether there will be more handsome men waiting there. Ferda casually points out that Jed will be there, at least. Echidna's face lights up with a grin, while Jed's mood takes a completely different turn. He can only stand there in fear, wishing that Ferda would take him along instead. The following morning, the scene moves to Ruri reviewing the list of people they still need to meet. She realizes that only one name remains, Halis Fabatus. For the first time, she recognizes someone on their list. Halos Fabatus is known as the Sage of Water, a man renowned for his wisdom and ability to perceive the essence of things. Despite receiving highly lucrative offers from the Argan Empire, he repeatedly rejected important positions they offered him. He is affiliated with nowhere and is regarded as an aesthetic wizard. Ruri explains to Ferda that someone like Hellas cannot be won over with wealth or authority, leaving her curious about how Ferda intends to convince him. Ferda's answer catches her off guard. He has no particular interest in the Sage of Water himself. According to Ferda, the man is merely connected to the thing he is actually searching for. The individual Ferda truly wants to find is someone who does not even have a name. With that mysterious statement hanging between them, Ferda and Ruri continue walking beside the river. A short distance away, they notice a blonde-haired girl quietly washing clothes in the flowing water.